Welcome to the Word Room. I'm so glad you're here. We are going chapter by chapter through the entire Bible, breaking down a summary of each chapter, some key takeaways, and what it tells us about God. Today we are on Genesis chapter 25, which is halfway through the entire book of Genesis. And in this chapter, we see the introduction of Jacob, who is the next key player that God brings about in the covenant, ultimately looking to bring about the promised seed to Eve when they fell. So you don't want to miss this chapter. Let's go. All right, let's jump right into our summary of Genesis chapter 25. In this chapter, Abraham gave the full inheritance to Isaac, the promised seed, but he gives gifts to his other children. Yes, he had other children besides Ishmael. That is broken down in this chapter. So he gives gifts to his other children, but gives the full inheritance to Isaac. Abraham then dies and was buried by Isaac and Ishmael with Sarah in the cave that he purchased a few chapters back when Sarah died. So Isaac and Ishmael come together for that purpose. Then Isaac and Rebekah have twins. Esau and Jacob are born to Rebekah after many years. She was barren as well. Then God blessed them. Isaac prayed and God blessed them with twins, Esau and Jacob. God chose Jacob to be the one who would inherit the covenant that ultimately would continue on and would possess the land of Canaan. So God, in his sovereignty, chose Jacob. Esau then, almost in a bit of irony, ends up selling his birthright to Jacob for a meal, ultimately for a bowl of stew. So we'll look more at detail in that in just a moment, but he ends up selling his birthright to Jacob. So some key takeaways from this chapter. Let's break this down a little bit. Abraham had other children through another wife or concubine. This chapter calls her a wife. It used the word wife, but we see from First Chronicles that she was really a concubine who was probably elevated to the status of wife after Sarah passed away. Now, with that being said, this was not God's plan. God does not support concubines or multiple wives. This was not God's plan. We see that back in the early chapters of Genesis when God established marriage as between one man and one woman. This was something extra on top of that he added concubines, added extra wives. The Bible has a lot of things that are descriptive but not prescriptive. In other words, it's not a prescription for you to do this. It's a description of what happened. And there's a lot of things that happen that aren't necessarily God's plan. So he has other children through another woman. They were not the promised covenant seed. Isaac was. They were not God's plan. This wasn't God's plan to have these other children. However, these children do show that God honored his promise to make Abraham a father of many nations. That there were many nations that came. It talks about these children and the nations they became. So there were many nations that came from his line. This chapter also tells us about the descendants of Ishmael and Ishmael's death. This shows that God honored his promise earlier in Genesis as well, where God said, "And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him and make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly, and he shall become the father of 12 princes, and will make him a great nation." And that's exactly what happened. He has 12 sons, and it breaks that down here in this chapter. So God honored his promise about making Abraham a father of many nations. God honored his promise to bless Ishmael and for him to have 12 sons as well. So God honors his promise. We see that in those two areas. Then Ishmael dies, but was not buried in the family tomb, because that was reserved for the promise and those who would inherit the land of Canaan. So that tomb that Abraham purchased, that was for Sarah, for him, ultimately for Isaac, for Jacob, is for those who would inherit the promise. We see in this chapter also God showing that he is guiding the covenant. He is the one who chose Sarah to give birth to the promised seed, not Hagar or Keturah, which is the other concubine or wife of Abraham. We see that God chose Isaac as the covenant heir, not Ishmael or any of Abraham's other sons. And then this process continues on in this chapter. We see that God chooses Jacob, not Esau, who would be heir of the covenant. When Jacob and Esau were born, so these two sons of Isaac, their names were actually given to describe the circumstances. So Esau, the older brother who was born first, the word Esau actually means hairy because he was born with hair all over his body. And then Jacob, who was the younger brother, means heel holder or catcher because he grabbed his brother's heel when he was born. And that's how he got the name Jacob. That's how Esau got the name Esau. So notice God is the one who gave the name Isaac to Isaac, but Isaac and his wife Rebekah named Esau and Jacob based on the circumstances in which they were born. The idea of heel catcher, had the same idea as trickster or con man or scoundrel or rascal. That's kind of the idea of that, what heel catcher meant in that day. And they named him heel catcher because he literally grabbed Esau's heel as he was born. The idea of him being a trickster carries out throughout his life, as we'll see. So Jacob then cooks a stew and then sells it to his brother Esau for his birthright. Now, birthright is something that I think sometimes we don't fully understand in our culture, but the birthright involved both a material and spiritual blessing or inheritance. So with a birthright, you received a double portion of the inheritance, and you also, in this case, became the head of the family and the spiritual leader upon the passing of the father, which would be Isaac in this case. And in this case, the inheritance would be the covenant with God that God had made. So very, very important. Esau said that he was about to die. So he'd come in from the field. He was about to die, in his words. But he wasn't referring to actually dying right then without the food. He wasn't saying, I'm so tired. If you don't give me food, I'm going to die. What he was saying was, it was more like saying, I'm going to die one day. Who cares about the birthright? The birthright doesn't mean anything to me. He had no eternal mindset, no spiritual mindset. He was just thinking of the here and now. I don't care about the birthright. So he sells that birthright to Jacob. Jacob was actually wrong in taking advantage of his brother, but Esau was wrong for despising the birthright. So it's the idea of Jacob is trying to make it happen in the natural realm, which is what we saw Abraham do over and over, right? That's what he did with Hagar. That's what he did by lying to the Pharaoh or to Abimelech for trying to say his wife was a sister. He was trying to make it happen in the natural. Well, Jacob's doing the same thing. He's trying to make what God already promised happen in the natural. And while that is wrong, it is not, it is different. His heart was, I want, what God promised. So his heart was towards God. He just did it in the wrong way. Whereas Esau despised the birthright. He didn't care about the birthright. He wasn't thinking about it. He didn't care about this being, the covenant. He didn't care about any of it. So his heart was different. And that's what made Esau wrong. And we see Esau in the book of Hebrews. It talks about Esau that despising the birthright, despising the covenant, despising God follows him throughout his life. So 5 things this tells us about God. Number 1, he fulfills his promise. We see it over and over. He fulfilled his promise to make Abraham the father of many nations. He fulfilled his promise that he would bless Ishmael. We see it over and over and over. God fulfills his promise. We also see that God is sovereign. God makes the choice. God chose Abraham. God chose Sarah rather than Hagar. God chose Isaac rather than Ishmael. God chose Jacob rather than Esau. God in his sovereignty is choosing and making a plan. He is making elections. He is making choices. And in his sovereignty, those choices are bringing about his plan and his purpose. Very important concept of sovereignty that is being developed here that we will continue to see throughout Scripture. Number 3, his promise is bigger than you. Abraham dies, the promise continues. Even though Abraham was the one the covenant was made with, when he died, God just kept moving with the promise. He kept blessing Isaac. He kept bringing back, he chose Jacob. The promise keeps going. It's bigger than you. Number 4, he uses imperfect people. Jacob was not perfect. Jacob did wrong things. Jacob deceived his brother. Jacob tricked his brother. It was not right. He took advantage of him. And yet God still chose to use Jacob. God does not use perfect people. He uses imperfect people. And number 5, God cares about your heart. God looked and chose Jacob and looked at Esau, and he made a choice, and he could see the heart. Jacob's heart was towards the promises of God, even though in his flesh he did wrong things, whereas the heart of Esau was despising the covenant and promise of God. The heart matters. He cares about your heart. 5 things we learned about God. Dig deeper in this chapter. Comment down below what you got out of this, and I'll see you next time.